In 1988, I was Director of Clergy Care for Lutheran Social Services of the South. And my role was to provide therapy for Lutheran clergy and members of their family. Bob Bryan, a friend of mine, the head of the New Life Institute in Austin, said, "We're having Dr. Friedman coming here to speak. You might be interested." I was never interested in systems theory. But I thought, well, I know Bob, and I'll see what Dr. Friedman has to say. And I guess you might call that my Damascus Road experience. I was really enthralled by the rabbi. And at the end of the third day, I said to him, I don't know if I could pick up this theory anywhere around here as the way you present it. And he said, well, I have a postgraduate seminar in Bethesda, Maryland. I'll send you some information. And so I enrolled, and I thought for a year, but I actually stayed for 8 years with Dr. Friedman until his death in 1996. An Episcopal priest in our group was so thankful for what he learned from the rabbi that he made him a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker read, "Rabbi Jesus saved my soul, Rabbi Friedman saved my ass." Now you can see why I like this theory. Okay. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I have no intention to save either of those, but I hope I contribute to both. Okay. What I found most impressive about Bowen theory was his concept of the emotional system. When people come together, they form an emotional system. Now, when he used the word emotional, this is Barry Bowen. That was Dr. Friedman's mentor. He meant anything in your behavior that is instinctive, automatic, reflexive, mindless, and for the most part, defensive. So the Creator has made us creatures with this incredible capacity to protect ourselves. And that's what, as far as I'm concerned, why we have this reactive capacity. It's deep-seated, it's innate. These are behaviors you don't learn. They come with your DNA. However, when the emotional system gets stirred up because of anxiety, rather than defending ourselves, we create havoc among ourselves. So the key is the degree of the anxiety that is aroused in the emotional system and the length of it. And that becomes the key. And Dr. Friedman had this simple formula that I think is very helpful. HE equals RO. Sometimes he put it more in a mathematical formula, HE over RO, a nominator and denominator. But what he was really saying is that the hostility of the environment, that's the HE, is proportionate to or equal to the response of the organism. By that he was saying, what is most important is not the degree nor the length of the anxiety, not the number and the strength of the stressors, but what will be your response to it, your RO, the response of the organism, as opposed to simply reacting instinctively. And so when anxiety gets into a system, it's very easy for that anxiety to become infectious and to spread from one or two people into the whole group. And then reactivity only is fed again by more reactivity in the system. Now, let me talk a little bit about system. System is, our English word comes from a Greek word meaning coming together, coming together. A farm is a system. It's a system of soil, water, air, animals, people. And change one part of that system, and you'll change other parts of that system. Our body is a system. Our body is a good example to prove the statement, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which means when you put all the parts together, it creates a whole, and it's almost like a new creature. Much better than if you take our body and just separate it into different parts. The phrase, if mama ain't happy, nobody is happy, is a systems proverb. Okay. When you think systems, always think of interaction, mutual influence. And another key would be functioning position. And this will become clearer to you as we talk more and more about the theory. So an emotional system is about people. It's about people when they come and assemble and how they behave and act and how they're affected by one another, which is another way of thinking about human problems, distinct from what are the disturbances internally that create external problems. Okay. So let me talk about anxiety for a moment. I think anxiety has 5 major triggers, though I'm sure because we are human creatures, it can go beyond these 5. Number 1, disruptions. When we deal with change, loss, separation, accidents, it would be normal for us to be anxious. I'm sure the anxiety in Killeen today is greater than in Belton or other places, but because of what really happened right there in that immediate emotional system. Okay. Disruptions. I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he says, I think I can claim, neurologically, human beings would prefer familiarity even to happiness. We like things to be known and familiar. Secondly, feeling trapped. There's nothing that I can do to affect the outcome of this situation. And then you get into feelings of powerlessness, helplessness, hopelessness. You're pretty much stick into victim mentality. 3 would be differences. In fact, again, neurologically, we are designed to pick up signals from the environment where things are different and are unknown, bizarre, or novel. 4 would be uncertainty. We just don't know what might happen. And 5 would be anything we perceive or is actually real in terms of being a threat to our well-being. So just hostile forces. I think these are the 5 major events that key anxiety in our lives. Now, Paul Tillich, the theologian, added the fear of death, knowing that we are aware of the fact that life has a termination. But today, studies indicate that people in America are more fearful of public speaking than of dying. Okay. So maybe we want to add that to anxiety, public speaking. Okay. But on the other hand, anxiety can be helpful, can be positive. Keeps us from being careless. It stirs up the body to take action to protect the organism. It can be a spur, a motivation to change directions. So, for instance, when I do interventions with churches in conflict, my goal is not to reduce the anxiety, because anxiety is part of the motivation to change, but to reduce the level of the anxiety so we can get more to the response, the RO, and less of the reactivity, which has been controlling the system for the most part. Anxiety is an interesting word. It comes from the Latin word angora. It means to squeeze tightly. And every word in any language to indicate anxiety has something to do with the neck squeezing and choking. That's interesting. It's also related to words like angina, anger, and angst. So anxiety can be life-threatening if it's too extensive, too prolonged, too intense. But yet, on the other hand, we need some degree of anxiety to make some changes in our life. I like to say this: anxiety is not our enemy, it's an informer. And how we take that information, how we interpret it, what we do with it is the key. Now, I've discovered in working with churches, I've worked with 214 churches, 8 denominations, 26 states that have been in conflict. And I discovered there are 13 major triggers. I used to say 12, but there's been a new one appearing in the last 5 years. I'm not going to name them all, but I'll name some of them for you. Money. You follow the money trail, you follow the anxiety trail. I even worked with a congregation on the North Shore of Long Island, some of the priciest real estate in the state of New York. Shelter Rock Unitarian Church. They have over $300 million in endowment, and every year they add $20 million from the gas and oil royalties of the North Sea. And the per member giving is $82 a year. Their annual budget is $5 million. There are 500 members. They have 12 full-time staff. Okay. And I said to the treasurer, what is it like to have so much money? And he shocked me when he said, it's a pain in the ass. Well, I said, that's a curious answer. He says, well, we fight about who gets it, who makes decisions about the distribution. The money still arouses the anxiety. Okay. I was asked by a member of the congregation if I would come and do a workshop, and she asked me my fee. And I told her, and she said, could you double that so the people think you're worth it? I said, if you're interested in value, I could do far better than doubling. Okay. But the anxiety that money brings. It's about security, safety, self-preservation. Next, sex and sexuality. We just go off the boards when we have conversations. So most of the times we don't talk about it. And it goes underground. Okay. And of course the big one right now is is the gay lesbian issue all over the place. But there are other issues about what do we do about living together and serial monogamy and so forth. Next, in-laws. No, I'm kidding. But it sounds like a family, money, sex, and you'd expect in-laws to be. But the third one is somewhat like in-laws. It's called pastor's leadership style. What this really means is, for some people, I don't like the pastor. So they cloak it in this, I don't like the pastor's leadership style. Yet on the other hand, I think we clergy need to listen to laity. What they're saying to us is, we want you to do more than preach the gospel, be a witness to the gospel, administer the sacraments. We want you to be able to lead a congregation. Okay. And I think we need to listen to that. I don't know if in the past our seminaries prepared us for that. Okay. They prepared us to be chaplains. Okay. Not necessarily to be leaders, to stick our necks out, to take initiatives, to have a vision. But that's what the laity are asking for. Next, lay leadership style. You have lay leaders that are micromanagers. Some even function like Hitler, and others who are just apathetic and indifferent, and anything in between. Okay? But that's also a very key part, because in the Protestant church, leadership is shared among a lot of people. Next, space, territory, construction, building. We are emotional about our space. I fly a lot. The airlines provide 2 seats, but only 1 armrest. To which seat does it belong? It can get interesting. Okay. I know about this one. Next, harm done to a child or death of a child. People, that's probably a surprising one. But I think in our minds, we should be able to protect our young ones, or the church itself should be a safe place if that's where the harm or death occurred. And it just gets assist. I could give you 20 examples of this at least, where this was one of the stimulants of anxiety. Staff conflict, staff resignation. People today emotionally identify with a particular member of the staff. It may not be the pastor or the senior pastor, but somebody who is functioning in a leadership role. And when there's conflict or that person has to resign, you can imagine anxiety arising. Now, here's the new one. And it's been in 37 of my last 43 or 44 interventions over the last 4 or 5 years. Something that has to do with the change process. It's done too soon. It's done too late. It's done slovenly. It's done inappropriately. The system wasn't ready for the change. Now, out of this experience, I've learned something that I think is extremely important for us. Change will be resisted less if it's connected to mission. And, this is so important because as we now face a changing context of ministry, and we know there are going to have to be some changes, before we even institute the particular change, we need to build up a sense of mission. Who we are, why we're here, what is this all about? And this, again, is not something my generation was not trained to deal with. How do you do change? We're not trained to be change agents. We're trained to be chaplains. I was with 2 seminary presidents recently, and I said, you have it harder even than a parish pastor in a sense like this. You have to maintain the homeostasis. You have to see that the institution goes on. Yet in this changing world, you have to have a few disruptors. You have to have a few folks out there that are saying we can't do it the same way. So how do you keep that balance between the two? And all of us in any kind of leadership role are probably facing the same tension. That's the vice we're in. How do we maintain what we have, yet also change things? I put it this way. How do we stay centered on the mission as we try to change our forms? How do we stay centered on the mission as we change our forms? Edward Deming, who was an organizational expert, I've been wrestling with his statement. It's a famous axiom. Your system is perfectly designed to give you the results you are getting. Wow. If 80% of the congregations in the United States are at a plateau or in decline, if 3,000 to 3,500 congregations annually are closing, the results aren't very positive. Does that have something to do with the design? Do we have to, use another word, reform, that's a word from church history, what we have today? And of course, that will be resisted by what we know in systems theory, and we call it homeostasis. Institutions, organizations, congregations prefer stability and coherence. Once a pattern of behavior develops, it tends to stay in place. And then when you want to move it out of that groove, you get resistance, rebellion, anger, frustration, anxiety, etc. But if we're not necessarily trained on how to do that or given some assistance, we get caught up in all of that. That's why we have church conflict as a growth industry. How are we going to better deal with what's out there? And it's not just clergy who have to learn, it's also our lay leaders, our elders, and our deacons, whatever title we give to people. How do we handle these things better? Now, my last 2 interventions, one was, I won't name the church, but it's a small Episcopal church south of Austin. And the other one is a large Missouri Synod church in Wisconsin. The church in Wisconsin was at one time the largest Missouri Synod church in terms of worship attendance in the country. I think they worshiped 4,000 on a Sunday. They now worship 750. For 20 consecutive years, they've had problems with clergy. And the problem has always been the clergy. It was a system that needed what we call an identified patient. It needed a scapegoat for all the tensions going on in their life. And then the little church, Episcopal church down in south of Austin, it's been there for 125 years. And at most it may have had 70 members, but normally it's around 50 or 60 members. But they had sufficient income to have a full-time pastor. But because of the low salaries, pastors came for every 2 to 3 years. They now have a pastor who stayed there for 6 years. His tenure is up. He should be moving on. Plus, he couldn't live in the rectory because there were certain odors and his wife was sensitive to them. So they bought a home 14 miles out of town. So when you have your rector next door for 120 years, and now you have a rector living 14 miles out of town. That's a major challenge to the system. Secondly, he's been there too long. Okay? And so there was a little group ready to get rid of him. And what was the major charge? Our church isn't growing. For 125 years, they voted not to grow, and now they're blaming them they're not growing. Okay. That's why I always say the presenting problem is seldom the presenting problem. There are others underneath. Now, up in Wisconsin, they want to get rid of the current pastor who's there. Okay. Well, he has some issues, but he also has some abilities. Okay. And for 20 years, they have focused on how the pastor functioned. They never focused on themselves. All right. And he is trying to get them to focus on mission. Okay? Because if you're not focused on mission, you're focused on something. And a lot of times it's the pastor's performance or lack thereof or whatever. Or it's the golden years with the golden pastor, or it's the budget, or the youth and young families you don't have. There's some focus, okay? And those folks up there in Wisconsin, they've got to go some probably 3, 4, or 5 year struggle to get back and be more reflective about who are we and less about who is the pastor. Well, these are just two examples of what happens. And then, of course, as people get frustrated and disappointed, the anxiety rises. Now, I have found that 5 or 6 of these universal triggers happen either serially or simultaneously. And if they do, the system should be anxious. Anxiety is not abnormal. It should be anxious. Okay? It's not an enemy. It's an informer. But the problem comes in, how do we deal with the anxiety? We fight fire with fire. We become reactive to reactivity. We start blaming, scolding, accusing. We keep looking for the problem, the black box of the congregation. Okay? So anxiety, I think, is really helpful to all of us in that it arouses in a moment when we can learn something. I say to congregations that hire me, the reason you have hired me is to help you not waste your suffering. Because if you don't learn something at this moment, the chances of repeating it, whether it's next year or 10 years or 20 years, are very high. Because the system hasn't shifted. And I know this, no emotional system will change unless the people in that system change how they function with one another. And if they keep fighting one another, keep looking for the sickos in the pastoral ministry or whatever, it's not going to change. It gets built into the system. So I'm not here to give you recommendations. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to empower you. I'm here to help you make good decisions for yourself. I don't want you to be dependent on me. By the way, that's always a problem because there are always people out there that think, well, we hired somebody from the outside, we're paying them good money. They should be experts about what to do. Okay? But I say, no, you're the experts. You live here. You're the ones who have to make the decisions, not me. I said, I'll come and do a process with you. I remember a lawyer in Houston once said to me, what's your rate of success? It wasn't a question for information. It was a question to try to embarrass me, okay? And I said, I'm glad you asked that question because I've never thought. My rate of success is 100%. I contracted to do a process and I complete it. Okay? Now, whether or not congregations are successful in dealing with the issue depends on the maturity and the motivation of the leadership. And I can prove that one pretty simply, okay? So again, when the system is anxious, they look outside of themselves for inspiration, motivation, answers, solutions, and so forth. I'm there as the process person to help them, to empower them, to enlighten them, whatever you want to call it. But of course, not every people like to be enlightened. I said to my wife one day, I have a funny job. These people search me search to find me, pay me to listen to them and tell them what I heard, and I do it. And then they get mad at me. You know? But you know the old statement, if you don't like the message, you shoot the messenger. Okay. Winston Churchill once said, nothing in life is more exhilarating than to be shot at and missed. Okay. I've had some good times. The anxiety doesn't recede just because you're there. Sometimes you even increase the anxiety. Not too long ago, I remember a man took my report and actually shoved it up my nose and said, ever since we've had your report, things have gotten worse here. And I said, most of the time that happens. And of course, he didn't know what to do after that. He thought I'd try to defend it and so forth. But my approach to this is, if we are anxious souls, anxiety serves a purpose. Okay? But once it gets out of control, it becomes harmful. In fact, the Greek word for anxiety is merimna, which means excessive worry. Worry that goes way beyond where it should be. It's out of proportion. It doesn't say don't worry, don't be anxious, in the sense of the way it's rather natural, but don't let that anxiety control you. So that brings up a very important part of Bowen theory, being a non-anxious presence. Well, some people don't like that phrase because there is no such creature. And they would rather use the phrase being a less anxious person. But whether you use the one or the other, it's still the same thing. What it's really saying is, don't allow your instinctive side control your life. Have some capacity to regulate yourself when even you have been stirred up, or you're facing the stirring up in somebody else. Because what we're always doing is dealing not only with your own anxiety, but the anxiety that's out there in the system. Okay? And one of the things that the system attempts to do when I come into that congregation and work with it is to get me into the anxiety. Okay? Somebody picks me up at the airport, and we walk into the parking garage. And the person says, well, let me tell you what's happening. Oh, I better not tell you. I'll prejudice you. And then for another 30 minutes, tells me the problem. Okay? And then it's uncanny, because on the way back to the airport, somebody else who's on the other side takes me and says, well, let me tell you the truth. Okay? I don't know what you heard. So they're trying to pull me into their anxiety, and it's so important that I be the non-anxious presence. It has an impact on the whole system. And that's true of anybody when they're in a leadership position. Anxiety flows down and out. Anxiety flows down and out. In fact, I would even say when the leadership is highly anxious, the system is leaderless. There's nobody there who has the capacity to be reflective. Anxiety makes us dumber. Okay? We just can't think as accurately and completely as we do when we're non-anxious. That's why the advice is very appropriate. Don't make key decisions in your life when you're anxious. See? You're not going to be looking at all the options and alternatives and so forth. Dr. Friedman called it imaginative gridlock. Your imagination is locked in. You can't get to it because of the anxiety. He also called it the emotional barrier. There's something there that doesn't allow you to see what's out there. It holds you back. Now, congregations are emotional systems, like a workplace, like a marriage, like a team. Now, there aren't Episcopal emotional systems and Presbyterian emotional systems, and it's not divided by denominations. There are some nuances when you deal with systems, but the anxiety produces the same kind of reactivity and behaviors. Okay. And any system is prone to or vulnerable to have anxiety overwhelm it, or at least seep into it. And I can tell you from my experience, the healthy systems are the ones that are able to take the RO and reshape what's there. And it's not always easy. It takes some time. So timing is important. I never want to speed up the process. Being in a hurry is an anxiety thing in itself, okay? And I want some time. So we're not as reactive, and we can do some thinking. But you can't do it too long because people become impatient. So I try to keep the intervention about 4 months. Seems to be appropriate time. Gives us enough time for the anxiety not to be so overwhelming and also not too long so it becomes frustrating. Now, I wrote 5 years ago that the conflict was becoming nastier, more mean-spirited, and the lying was increasing. I've been encouraged by my last 3 interventions. It's too small a sample to draw any conclusions. But my last 3 examples, I've seen people struggling and working extremely diligently on dealing with this issue. And I'm just wondering, are people getting tired of all of the fighting and oppositional kinds of stances in the world? I'm hoping that's part of it. The little church in south of Austin, the Episcopal Church, they've been working on it now for a year. I got an email from the new pastor at All Souls Unitarian Church in Kansas City. And she said, our leadership, you were here 2 years ago, our leadership is really focused on your report and trying to do things, but we still have the undercurrent of anxiety. And I said, I think in your case, you're going to have it for a couple more years, that undercurrent. But don't forsake your RO. This is a very fascinating Unitarian church because the former pastor wrote the Humanist Manifesto. So this was basically a secular humanist congregation. But the church has been growing. And some people from Protestant groups have been coming in, and they want candles and different hymns and a scripture reading. And so now you got this battle going on between the secularist humanist and the fuzzy theist. It's very fascinating to watch it. And so the major problem that they had up there really has the undercurrent with this more, I guess you would call it, theological problem. Okay. But she said, I'm going to call you next week if it's appropriate. I want to tell you what's happening. I want to talk to you about what you saw here and everything else. Now, one thing I can say to her, I couldn't say in a report or to other people, I know that 2 of the people who are still unhappy are 2 people that came out of abusive families. And when you get sometimes these controversies, they play out some things from other experiences. Okay? And I'm just not pinpointing those people. That could be any of us here, unknowingly pay out unfinished issues. So I'm hopeful that the congregations are making some shifts in terms of where they are. And personally, it has to happen. Because if we continue to fight among ourselves, our focus will be on ourselves, not our mission. And we can't afford that in the future because of the diminution of numbers, resources, and influence. Okay? We can't continue to find ourselves at battle with one another because outsiders will see it. In the book Unchristian, it's interesting. When they ask people, why aren't you coming to church? It's because of the behaviors they've seen in Christians. Homophobic, insensitive, etc. Not it's boring, it's irrelevant, which happened 20 years ago. But today it's more, what do I see in the Christian community? Our witness, or our lack of it, really. So remember this, anxiety may not be comforting or comfortable to deal with, But it's just a signal. It's a piece of information. But what will be key is how we handle it, and can we handle it? I have found I only need about 3 or 4 people who catch the theory, who catch what I'm talking about, and they can carry the day for the church. You don't need 50 people right at the moment. So I always look, where are those 4 or 5 key people who I can influence that might be able to carry the load till others get on board and so forth. Very, very key factor. Let me say something too now about change. Whether we like it or not, we're going to have to do some changing. And that's going to stir up the homeostatic forces in a congregation. And there will be resistance and rebellion. But Dr. Freeman said, you know, part of the leadership process is to go out and take initiative, offer a vision. And then when people become reactive to it, don't pull back and go back into the shell. Okay? Too many of us do that. Because we want to take care of people's feelings. That's not our responsibility, to take care of what people do. Hurt feelings have never killed anybody, Dr. Freeman said. But anxiety has the potential to do it. Okay? We want to reduce pain in other people's lives. I mean, there's some compassion in that, but at the same time, many of us from studies indicate we're embarrassed by other people's pain, or we feel awkward in the presence of their pain. And rather than knowing that pain is a teacher without which we cannot live, and the pain can help us move to another level, we try to eliminate the pain. Dr. Freeman once said, to the degree that you can tolerate pain in another person or in an organization is the degree to which they will grow. So my whole approach in dealing with anxious systems is not to reduce or eliminate the anxiety, but at least to put the anxiety at a level where we can be more thoughtful. Let me give an example. I was working with Grace Episcopal Church in New York City. It has an endowment of about $55 million. There are some extremely wealthy, prominent people in the parish. And the rector at the time was a former Harvard law professor. Wrote excellent sermons. I used to go over and pick up copies. Very, very, very capable in expression, but an extremely immature person. Had temper tantrums, throw things at people, etc., if he didn't get his way. And finally, the vestry said, you have to resign. We can't tolerate this. He did resign. But while he was there, he brought in about 80, 90 Gen Xers, young adults, who probably saw him as a pretty good father figure. And they insisted, we have to have an opportunity to talk about this publicly. Now, I have never in my interventions up to this point wanted a vent your spleen, get it off your chest session. All that does is give more credence to the instinctive side. And that's all that's been going on already. Why should I reinforce it? But they were so insistent, so I came up with a process called Tell It to Peter. And I set down guidelines, and we had a public discussion. And I've done some modification of this process since I first did it there at Grace. But basically, I wouldn't eliminate it anymore. What people do is come up to a microphone and they talk to me directly. Okay? They have 2 minutes to talk. They cannot scold, complain, accuse. The audience cannot hiss, boo, or cheer. There'll be 60 minutes. If you want to go beyond 60 minutes, by a 3/4 vote, we can go for another 15 minutes. I may be able to ask you questions. You cannot speak a second time until everybody's been given a chance to speak the first time. And then I'll say, here are the ground rules. Do you want to make some changes? Or does anybody want to add anything to it? We agree with the guidelines. Okay. Now, there's a value in that, because when they violate the guidelines, they're not fighting you, they're fighting whom? the guidelines. All right, I'm in La Jolla, California. Congregation of 2,500. We're doing Tell It to Peter. There are 1,500 people present. There are 8 microphones in this huge yard. Okay? It's going to take 60 minutes. Okay? This was a great one because every time someone got to the microphone, they gave their credentials. I am the president of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I am the former ambassador to Spain. I am the former editor of the Miami Herald. I am the head of the California Department of Transportation. I mean, that's the way it went. Okay. And during the Tell It to Peter, one individual, his 2 minutes was up. And my timer was waving the flag. And I asked him to please conclude in 10 seconds. Sit down. So he turns to the audience. He says, how many of you want me to continue? And then there's the clapping and cheering. Okay. And so he turns around to continue. And when he does, there's the booing and the hissing. So I'm in deep doo-doo. Fortunately, I had enough sense to say, if it's not quiet in 10 seconds because both the individual and the group has violated the guidelines, the process will be over. It got quiet immediately. Okay. It also gave me another clue. Don't lose control of the process, no matter how much reactivity goes on. And don't react to the reactivity. And we continued. Okay. But the process allows people to speak publicly, and with the guidelines, they can speak civilly and responsibly rather than out of their instinctive side. I wanted to get them up to their reflective side. And another one of the guidelines is you have to use I statements. You cannot use you statements. And I make it very clear that blame will not be acceptable. Blame does not add anything to the healing process. And then I can also demonstrate reflective listening. I've heard you say that you think you keep hearing the same sermon every Sunday. I'm curious, do you like it? Something like that, where I can just have a conversation with them and reflect back how to listen. It's also part of the process in that it provides me information, and I have 2 people as recorders, so I don't have to sit there and try to remember everything everybody said. And then that also becomes a piece of information when I write a report. But it's important that people have a chance to speak out of their frustration, but not to do it in a way that hurts or harms somebody else. So I even do this sometimes to teach bishops. Tell it to the bishop. When they have to go into some really deep-seated, hot issue, okay, use the guidelines. Okay? Use the guidelines. And it also keeps the discussion at this level rather than down here. And we try to do that also in the rest of the process. How do we keep it at this point? I remember Dr. Freeman saying one time, you know, when you deal with these hot issues, keep asking the people, what's our best thinking about this? What's our best thinking about this? All right, now I'm going to add a couple other pieces to the Bowen theory. There are 8 principles. We'll go on here for another 20 minutes and we'll take a break. Functioning position. When you get into a system, you develop a functioning position. Others also get into a functioning position. One of my functioning positions at home is to take out the garbage. And when we fill up the little brown grocery bag, I'm very good about getting it out to the receptacle. But I travel. I'm gone 4 or 5 days. When I return, there are 4 or 5 bags in memory of my absence. I live with fastidious, intelligent, industrious people. Why the hell don't they take out the garbage? Because I overfunction with it, and they do what? Underfunction with it. That's my function. There are days my wife gets in the house beautiful mode, and she will work feverishly to clean the house, and then come to me and my son and say, she's doing all the work. And I said, hon, you're over-functioning. No, don't say that. Okay. You get the idea, though, right? And we clergy tend to be over-functioners, to take care of everything, solve everything, and so forth. That's over-functioning. Okay. I remember this. I lost the hearing in my left ear in 1989. It was during Christmas time. And there's very little cure for it with sudden hearing loss. And my daughters were home from college, and they were trying to be the comforters of Peter. Dad, don't worry about it. You have one good ear. Dad, you don't let adversity get you down, and so forth. And in January, I went to Bethesda, and I told Dr. Friedman, you know, I can't even suffer in my own family. And he said, well, you helped develop this system. What are you going to do? That's not what I was looking for, but we develop these systems, and we assume these positions, or we allow ourselves to get into these positions, functioning positions. And I remember Ed once saying, if you have a church council and you have one person that's a paranoid and another person who is lazy and irrelevant, once they leave office, you need to replace them with somebody who's lazy and irrelevant and someone who's fearful. It'll help the system stay the same, okay? That's how he was trying to get the point across. All right. When you begin to change your functioning position in the family doesn't give you banquets and gold watches. They give you grief. Get back to where you were. And we see this often in terms of people coming out of recovery. If they now begin to function in a new way, it takes the enabler out of his or her position. It takes the rest of the family who keep silent out of their position. So get back to your old position. It's familiar, it's known, it's where we are. It's interesting that even if taking up a new functioning position is healthy and improves situations, the tendency is still to go back to the old one because it's known and comfortable to people. I have had to learn myself. I'm the third of 6 children, so I'm the middle child. I look both ways. Okay. And I'm pretty adaptable. I have good relationships with my brothers and sisters. But what I found out was I was too adaptable. I had to find ways to take my position irrespective of the other person. And we all have our learning. I don't like to call it dysfunction. I like to call it learning opportunity to function in another way. The functioning position is important. Another one besides over and under is pursuit and distance. Okay. I remember I had this pastor's wife. She said, I'm going to find the key to this man. And I said, yeah, you know, once you find the key, he's going to take it and hide it in another place. That's your marital dance. You pursue, and he distances. Okay. What you'll have to learn to help this marriage have more balance is for you to also do some distancing. So he has to do some pursuing. I remember during the course of the therapy, she said, you always focus on me. You never focus on him. You never do anything about him. And I said, I only work with the most motivated person, and it's you. I don't even know why he came here. He sits here like a bump in a log. I don't think he's really interested in anything. Okay. Well, he began to change functioning position, right? And then he began to pursue her and rather stay there in total silence. How do you shift that functioning position? It's very important. Okay? Imagine you go into a parish where your predecessor did everything, was an over-functioner. What are people going to expect of you? Same kind of functioning. Okay? Your predecessor was a happy-go-lucky backslapper panderer. What are they going to expect of you? Okay. Or if they were upset with that kind of functioning, what are they going to expect of you? Something else. That's why looking at functioning position is so important. Okay? And especially how did people do it in the past? And where are people now in terms of their expectations? Next is what we call societal emotional process. It used to be called societal regression, but that's too negative. It sounded like Freud. But societies can become anxious, not just small entities, but the macrocosm. Okay? And all of that anxiety out there in the society can seep into the smaller societies. So when you have society as regressive and anxious, it's going to seep into your systems. And I think that's what we're experiencing today in the church too. People bring their anxiety from their work, from their family relationships, other situations into the life of the church. Okay. That's fairly normal. But around 1960, Dr. Bowen and Dr. Freeman both agreed our society went into a regression. And when you're in a societal regression, it's very difficult on leadership. Very difficult. Because we know in emotional systems, people take their anxiety and focus it on two functioning positions. It has nothing to do with who fills the position. It's the position. Okay? The most responsible and the most vulnerable. So you focus on parent, president, principal, pastor. Or the most vulnerable, the immigrant, the female, the youngest, the newest on the staff, anyone who's not in the majority. That's what society does. That's the emotional process. When we become anxious, we focus it on those two functioning positions. The other day when I was in Iowa, Tuesday morning, I sat down and one person was on adjudicatory staff and her husband had just taken a new call, was in the parish 3.5 years. And he followed somebody who had been there 31 years. And he said it was only in the first month of his being there they found out that his predecessor had had a series of affairs. Okay. And I said to him, well, you didn't know this, but you're an after pastor is what we call them. And people will not make distinction between him and you. They're always going to deal with the position. Okay? You're in this position and you're going to get some of that anxiety. Okay? It just happens. It's the projection that goes on. It's the displacement. It's not about you. It's about folks who are anxious and needing to get rid of it. That's hard to realize sometimes. So pastors are always going to have anxiety focused on that. They're always going to be caught in the different triangles that develop. In fact, remember this, when you're a pastor of a congregation, you are potentially a member of every triangle in every family in your congregation. I mean, bishops and church heads have it even worse. They're potentially victims of all of the families that are out there, not just the local one congregation. And I'll talk more about triangles later. But that's where people focus their anxiety. They don't waste it focusing on the sexton. They don't focus it on the mailman. They focus on responsible, most vulnerable. One last thing, and then we'll take a break, and then I will continue this with talking about Bowen's second most important concept, the differentiation of self. We've talked about societal emotional process, functioning position, and an emotional system. The next one is also very important. It's called the family emotional projection process. Okay. That things that happened in the past continue to get projected outward into the future. And this is very biblical, by the way. The sins of the fathers are visited upon the third and fourth generation. It's very generational. Or I like the way Jeremiah said it. The fathers have eaten the bitter fruit, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Okay. And sometimes a certain characteristic of a family system skips a generation and shows up in a later generation. Okay. Now, my brothers and I, since we're getting older, are sharing medical histories. and we're pulling information about the medical history of our parents and our grandparents, because we know there's a lot of value in that. What has been the identified organ in our family, okay? And from my father's side, it's been the heart, okay? I had a younger brother who had a heart attack. I have an older brother who has a stent. I had triple bypass surgery, okay? So we know that's the identified organ whenever we get anxious, where the anxiety goes, or where it's been weaker in terms of the DNA. That doesn't mean everybody's going to have heart problems in our family, but it's important to know that kind of information. And then there are certain things we project into the family, okay? Things that we don't realize this, but we want the family to carry on this characteristic or something or other. I have seen a characteristic in my wife's family that she doesn't see as much as I see, but that's very typical. But how something in her family history has become a part of who she is, that goes back a couple generations. Okay. And we always can see it easier out there than we can in here. Okay. But it's helpful to know the information, not in the sense that you're dysfunctional, you're a character flawed person, but what's going on with you. Okay. I remember this pastor, he had a certain kind of behavior that irked his wife all the time. Okay. And she was trying in a compassionate way, not in a nasty way, to tell him about this behavior, to help him. Okay. But he was very defensive. And I remember he said to his wife, listen, the reason I'm this way, he was really into Myers-Briggs. I don't know what the letters were, but he said, I'm an INFJ. She says, no, the reason you behave this way is because you're a JERK. Okay. There are different theories of personality. Okay. But again, if we can use the information as a help, rather as a way to get at somebody, you hear what I'm saying, we can do more RO than we would have otherwise. All right, let's take some time for questions here, and then we'll take a break. We have a microphone that we can pass around if you have some questions.
What if you're in a staff position that is not the senior pastor or senior minister type situation, and how do you then maneuver or get caught up in the larger organizational system? A lot of the illustrations were about senior pastor.
Good question. By the way, Mike Bonham in Houston has written a book called Leading from the Second Chair, which people have found to be a very helpful book. Now, if you're new, if the position's new and you're the first person there, you're going to blaze the trail. You're going to set up the functioning that's going to happen for the second person. If you follow somebody, you've got the same thing. How did my predecessor behave? What did the system expect of my predecessor? Or do they expect me to behave in a way different from my predecessor? So how do people look at somebody in the second chair, and how do you look at being at the second chair? And of course, if you're in the second chair and you want to be in the first chair, okay, that's going to dictate your behavior too. Okay, but can you be satisfied with being in the second chair and using this now as a learning process for myself? But it's the same process that'll happen. It's just a different functioning position.
I followed someone at the current position I'm in as preaching minister who served there for 25 years and then retired. He's now ministry emeritus. We get along fine, have coffee together once a week and pray together, that kind of thing. And that's been 7 years ago. I've been there 7 years. But I was just wondering if you wanted to try to follow someone like him who's been there 25 years and continues there. What advice do you typically give people who are trying to navigate that and, to try to have the best ministry you can have?
Good question. And partly you've already answered that you and that person have a good relationship at some level, okay? And that the boundaries are very clear. What you expect the other person to do and not do, and also to be invitatory, to invite the person back for certain kinds of things, but you're clear about what the boundaries are. If you become enemies, you're creating an incredible trap for problems. I've just seen it so often. Yeah. And I've seen also people who have been succeeded look back at their successor and they're not doing it right, which means they're not doing it the way I did. And they'll go underground and use other people to get at you, okay? But I think your example is great. How can I best work with this man? And we have a common understanding about what will happen and what will not happen, and the boundaries are clear. Yeah. I also think whoever succeeds should probably leave for 3 years to allow you to get into the saddle, to allow you to establish your identity. It could be 2 years. Unless the person is that mature and can allow you to take the saddle without any interference.
You mentioned this idea about leading from a second chair. I'm a middle child. I'll schedule therapy for that later.
You're scheduled to do what?
I said I'll schedule some therapy with you later. But I'm a peacemaker. I like to be the peacemaker. I get myself totally involved with other people's systems instead of being the thinking up here kind of guy.
Okay.
How do you get to that place, or what does it take to get to a place of being the impartial, our best thinking kind of person?
Well, you almost asked me a month too soon, because the Samaritan Center in Buffalo, New York, has asked me to address the issue, peacemaker or peacemonger. I haven't sat down to think about it, but I'll give you my top of the thing. If you're a peacemonger, you have some sense of awkwardness in the presence of pain. So take a look at yourself. Where did that come from? Do I really need to do that? Okay. And peacemakers, and we're all, pretty much anybody who goes into ministry has some desire, mostly, to be a peacemaker, to have tranquility. But your role doesn't always call for peacemaking. It also calls sometimes for disturbing the system. Okay. Will you be able to be a leader and initiator? You have to ask yourself that question. But the prior question is, where did this come from? Was I hurt? Was it from something, communication in the family? Was it just something where I'm more comfortable? Where do I have to grow in this thing? And I say this in a very honest and open way. You know, you may even try therapy. I don't see therapy as you're screwed up and you're defective and you need some help. I see it as an opportunity to grow. Okay. Get some information about yourself.